Why don't we plus verb? Why don't we go hiking? Why don't we go camping? Why don't we plan a picnic? Why don't we go for a walk? Why don't we plant a garden? Why don't we plant a garden? Why don't we start a podcast? Why don't we have a barbecue? Why don't we try a yoga class? Why don't we take a road trip? Why don't we have a beach day? Why don't we try a new recipe? Why don't we try rock climbing? Why don't we play a board game? Why don't we start a book club? Why don't we go on a bike ride? Why don't we go to a jazz club? Why don't we try paddleboarding? Why don't we try paddleboarding? Why don't we take a dance class? Why don't we learn how to dance? Why don't we go to a comedy club? Why don't we go to a comedy show? Why don't we go to a sports game? Why don't we take a scenic drive? Why don't we cook dinner at home? Why don't we cook dinner at home? Why don't we learn a new language? Why don't we have a DIY craft day? Why don't we take a pottery class? Why don't we have a karaoke night? Why don't we try a new restaurant? Why don't we take a cooking class? Why don't we go to a wine tasting? Why don't we take a painting class? Why don't we attend a live concert? Why don't we have a movie marathon? Why don't we watch a movie tonight? Why don't we bake cookies together? Why don't we have a barbecue party? Why don't we go to a museum exhibit? Why don't we take a weekend getaway? Why don't we go to a poetry reading? Why don't we go to a music festival? Why don't we have a spa day at home? Why don't we grab a coffee together? Why don't we grab a coffee together? Why don't we take a photography walk? Why don't we go to a farmer's market? Why don't we have a picnic at sunset? Why don't we try a new outdoor sport? Why don't we go to a community event? Why don't we volunteer for a charity? Why don't we visit a farmer's market? Why don't we build a puzzle together? Why don't we have a family game night? Why don't we take a photography class? Why don't we try a meditation session? Why don't we go to a planetarium show? Why don't we have a family movie night? Why don't we try a new board game together? Why don't we take a pottery class together? Why don't we have a picnic in the backyard? Why don't we take a cooking class together? Why don't we visit the museum this weekend? Why don't we visit the museum this weekend? Why don't we go to a local farmer's market? Why don't we have a technology-free weekend? Why don't we have a game night with friends? Why don't we try a new restaurant each month? Why don't we try a creative writing workshop? Why don't we have a game night with neighbors? Why don't we take a day trip to a nearby city? Why don't we try a virtual reality experience? Why don't we try a DIY home improvement project?